The Friday evening traffic crawled along Mason Street as Officer Mark Henderson sat in his patrol car, watching vehicles pass by. His dashboard clock read 8:45 p.m. when a black Mercedes caught his attention. The car wasn't speeding, but something about the driver's behavior made Mark's instincts kick in. The vehicle seemed to drift slightly between lanes, and the driver appeared to be looking around nervously. Mark activated his patrol car's lights. The Mercedes took longer than usual to pull over, finally stopping near a busy shopping center. Several pedestrians slowed their pace, their attention drawn to the scene unfolding before them. Mark approached the vehicle, his right hand resting near his holster, a habit formed over 12 years on the force. The driver, David Wilson, kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. He wore an expensive suit, and his backseat held a briefcase and legal documents. "Officer, is there a problem?" David's voice was steady, professional. Mark's flashlight beam swept across the car's interior. "License and registration." His tone was clipped, authoritative. As David reached for his glove compartment, Mark's hand tightened on his holster. Slowly. "Officer, I'm an attorney. I'm just reaching for my—" David began, but Mark cut him off. "Step out of the vehicle." The command came sharp and sudden. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Cell phones emerged from pockets, their cameras recording. David hesitated. "Sir, I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong." Mark's patience snapped. He yanked the car door open, grabbed David's arm, and forcefully pulled him from the vehicle. David stumbled, his expensive suit scraping against the asphalt. The crowd gasped. More phones appeared, recording the scene. "Spread your legs. Hands on the hood." Mark's commands echoed in the growing silence. David complied, his face pressed against his own car's hood, the humiliation burning in his chest. "I'm a lawyer," David repeated, his voice strained. "My father is—" "Quiet," Mark barked, conducting a rough pat-down. The watching crowd had grown larger, their murmurs of disapproval getting louder. David felt the cold metal of handcuffs click around his wrists. His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not to Thomas Wilson's son. Years of his father's warnings about being careful, about how success didn't protect you from prejudice, crashed through his thoughts. Mark began reciting David's rights, his voice mechanical, rehearsed. But something felt different this time. The crowd's energy had shifted from curious to hostile. Someone shouted, "This isn't right!" Another voice called out, "We're watching you, officer!" In that moment, both men felt the weight of what was unfolding. For David, it was the crushing realization that his status, education, and family name couldn't shield him from this treatment. For Mark, though he wouldn't admit it yet, it was the first crack in his certainty, the beginning of doubt in a system he'd always defended. The scene would soon explode across social media, but neither man knew that yet. They didn't know about Anna watching at home, or Sarah Lopez already receiving tips about the incident. They couldn't predict how this routine traffic stop would unravel the fabric of their community and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. Anna Henderson sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone when the video appeared on her Facebook feed. Her coffee cup froze halfway to her lips as she watched her husband, Mark, dragging a well-dressed black man from his car. The timestamp showed it had happened just 40 minutes ago. Her hands shook as she replayed the video. After 15 years of marriage to a police officer, she'd defended Mark countless times in her social circles, even as her work as a civil rights activist put her in increasingly difficult positions. But this was different. This was raw, undeniable. The front door opened. Mark's heavy footsteps in the hallway made her spine stiffen. He entered the kitchen, still in uniform, exhaustion etched across his face. "Want to explain this?" Anna held up her phone, the video still playing. Mark's jaw clenched as he recognized the scene. "It's not what it looks like," he said, opening the refrigerator, his back to her. The guy was acting suspicious. Wouldn't follow commands. "Commands?" Anna's voice rose. "I watched the whole thing, Mark. He told you he was a lawyer. He had his hands where you could see them. What exactly was suspicious about him?" Mark slammed the refrigerator door. "You weren't there. You don't understand what it's like out there. Every traffic stop could be your last. We're trained to—" "Don't," Anna cut him off. "Don't hide behind training. That man was compliant. You escalated it." She paused the video on a clear shot of David's face pressed against the car hood. "Look at this. Really look." Mark finally turned to face her. "What do you want me to say, Anna? That I was wrong? That I should have just let him talk his way out of it because he's wearing an expensive suit? I want you to admit what this really was." Anna's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because if you can't see it, if you won't acknowledge it, then I don't know who you are anymore." The silence between them stretched thick and heavy. Their phones buzzed simultaneously. The video was going viral. Local news stations were picking up the story. Comments flooded social media, dividing quickly into two camps, those defending police protocol and those crying racism. "The department will back me on this," Mark said finally. "It was a legitimate stop." Anna stood up slowly. "You still don't get it. This isn't about department policy. This is about right and wrong. And what you did—" She stopped, choking back tears. "What you did was wrong, Mark." "He kept reaching for something," Mark insisted, but his voice wavered slightly. "I had to ensure his registration. He was reaching for his registration because you asked for it." Anna's hands clenched into fists. "And you know what the worst part is? You don't even know his name, do you?" Mark's silence was answer enough. "David Wilson," she said, "son of Chief Justice Thomas Wilson. But that shouldn't matter, should it? Because no one deserves to be treated that way. No one." The implications of that name hit Mark like a physical blow. Chief Justice Wilson, the most powerful judge in the state, the man who'd spoken at their police academy graduation about justice and integrity. Mark felt the first real stirrings of fear. Their phones kept buzzing. The story was spreading. Somewhere across town, Sarah Lopez was already digging into Mark's service record, and David Wilson was sitting in his father's study, still in his dirty suit, deciding how to fight back. Sarah Lopez stared at her computer screen in the newsroom of the City Herald, surrounded by the chaos of breaking news. The video of Officer Henderson and David Wilson had reached 2 million views in just 3 hours. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing with tips from anonymous sources within the police department. "Lopez," her editor shouted across the room. "What's the angle?" "It's bigger than just another police incident," Sarah replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "The victim is Chief Justice Wilson's son. But here's what's interesting. I've got records of 3 similar stops by Officer Henderson in the past year, all involving minorities, all escalating from routine traffic violations." The newsroom buzzed with activity as competing stories emerged. Conservative outlets painted Mark as a dedicated officer following protocol. Liberal media focused on David's credentials and family connections, highlighting the irony of a judge's son facing police brutality. Social media exploded with hashtags, "Was justice for David," competing with "Back the Blue." Outside the police station, crowds began gathering. Some carried signs supporting law enforcement, others demanding Mark's badge. The police chief called an emergency press conference, standing behind a podium, looking uncomfortable. "The department is conducting a thorough investigation of the incident," he announced, reading from a prepared statement. "Officer Henderson has been placed on administrative duty pending—" "Is it true? Officer Henderson has a history of similar incidents?" Sarah's voice cut through the murmurs. The chief's face tightened. "We don't comment on ongoing investigations or personnel matters." But Sarah already had her story. Her investigation revealed a pattern. Mark Henderson had been involved in 18 traffic stops in the past month. 15 involved minority drivers. None resulted in arrests or charges, but all included citations for minor infractions. The city began to divide. Police officers' families posted photos of fallen officers, sharing stories of dangers faced daily. Civil rights groups organized protests. Local businesses chose sides, some displaying blue line flags, others putting up Black Lives Matter signs. Mark sat in his living room, watching the coverage spiral. His phone rang. The police union representative. "Stay quiet," the rep advised. "We'll handle the press. Just lay low." But laying low became impossible. Someone leaked his home address online. Protesters gathered outside, their chants echoing through the windows. No justice, no peace. Anna watched from their bedroom as Mark paced downstairs. Her social media feeds filled with friends taking sides, some supporting her husband, others expressing disappointment in her silence. Her civil rights organization expected her to speak out. Her husband expected her loyalty. Sarah's first article went live at midnight. Pattern of prejudice. Officer Henderson's traffic stop history raises questions. The story included statistics, testimonies from previous stops, and expert analysis of racial profiling and traffic enforcement. By morning, national news picked up the story. Cable networks ran split-screen debates between police advocates and civil rights leaders. David Wilson's face became a symbol, his Harvard law degree and family connections making him the perfect figure to highlight systemic discrimination, proving it could happen to anyone, even the privileged. The police department's public affairs office released Mark's body camera footage, hoping to quell the uprising. Instead, it fueled more debate. The audio revealed David's calm responses, making Mark's escalation seem even more unwarranted. David Wilson sat in his father's mahogany-paneled study, his torn suit jacket draped over a leather chair. Chief Justice Thomas Wilson stood at the window, his back straight, hands clasped behind him. The silence between them carried the weight of generations. "I taught you to be careful," Thomas finally said, his voice heavy. "Ever since you were old enough to drive. I did everything right, Dad." David's words came out bitter, hands visible. "Yes, sir. No, sir. Everything you taught me. Everything you learned from your father." 3 generations of black men learning how to survive traffic stops. Thomas turned from the window. His judicial robes hung nearby, a symbol of authority that hadn't protected his son. "Your mother's called 4 times. She wants you to drop it. Says fighting will only make things worse." "And what do you say?" David challenged, standing up. "You've spent 30 years working within the system. You're the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, and your son still got dragged out of his car like a criminal." Thomas walked to his desk, pulling out a worn folder. Inside were newspaper clippings from the 1960s, his own father marching for civil rights. "The system doesn't change unless we force it to," he said quietly. "But you need to be sure. Once you start this fight, there's no going back." David picked up his phone, scrolling through messages. Colleagues from his law firm expressing shock and support. Old friends from Harvard Law offering legal assistance. His sister begging him to think about their mother's health before pursuing legal action. "I keep thinking about Jason," David said, referring to his childhood friend. "Remember when he got pulled over in high school? We all said he must have done something to provoke the officer. I defended the police. I actually defended them." Thomas sat heavily in his chair. "We all did. It's easier to believe there's a reason. That if we just do everything right, follow all the rules. But there is no right way to be wrong in their eyes, is there?" David's voice cracked. "Harvard Law, Supreme Court clerkship, partner at Wilson Reed, by 35. And none of it mattered the moment Officer Henderson saw my face through that window." His father pushed the folder of clippings toward him. Your grandfather used to say that change doesn't come from staying quiet, but he also said, choosing to fight means choosing to carry a weight that will follow you forever. David picked up his ruined jacket, feeling the rough scrapes where it had met the asphalt. I already carry that weight. Every time I walk into a high-end store, every time I have to dress extra professionally for client meetings, every time I see a patrol car in my rear-view mirror. Thomas stood, walking to his son. Then we fight. But we fight smart. We use the system's own tools against it, show them that the law either works for everyone or it works for no one. David nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing. I want Officer Henderson's badge. No, Thomas corrected. You want change. Real, lasting change. And to get that, we need to expose not just one officer, but the entire system that created him. Outside the study, David's phone buzzed with another call from Sarah Lopez. The media wanted his story, wanted to make him a symbol. His father was right. Once he stepped into that spotlight, there would be no going back. Sarah Lopez sat in her car outside the 7th precinct, reviewing her notes. 3 weeks of digging had revealed a pattern that made her stomach churn. Mark Henderson wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom. Her phone lit up with a text from her latest source. Loading dock, 10 minutes. Another officer willing to talk, another piece of the puzzle. She'd already interviewed 12 of Henderson's former partners, each conversation revealing more about the department's unwritten rules. The source, Officer Martinez, slipped into her car, constantly checking his surroundings. You didn't hear this from me, he began, hands shaking slightly. But Henderson's dashcam footage, the stuff from before the Wilson incident, some of it's gone missing from the database. Sarah's pen stopped moving. Gone how? Someone's cleaning house. Not just Henderson's footage. Other officers too. Anything that might show a pattern. Martinez wiped sweat from his forehead. There's more. Remember Lisa Thompson? Sarah nodded. 3 months ago, a black woman had filed a complaint against Henderson for aggressive behavior during a traffic stop. The department had dismissed it as unfounded. She wasn't the only one, Martinez continued. There were others, complaints buried, witnesses pressured to recant. It's all in the internal affairs files. Back at the Herald, Sarah laid out her evidence. Photos of Lisa Thompson's bruised wrists from too tight handcuffs. Statements from 4 other victims who'd never filed formal complaints, too afraid of retaliation. Statistics showing Henderson's district had the highest rate of traffic stops involving minorities. Her editor leaned back, whistling softly. This is dynamite, Lopez. But the department will deny everything. We need more. I've got more. Sarah pulled out her phone, playing a recording. Henderson's voice from 2 years ago, joking with other officers about maintaining order in certain neighborhoods. The casual racism was subtle but unmistakable. That evening, she sat across from Lisa Thompson in a quiet coffee shop. The woman's hands trembled as she stirred her untouched coffee. I never thought anyone would believe me, Lisa said quietly. When I filed that complaint, they made me feel crazy. Like I was imagining things. You weren't imagining it. Sarah showed her the pattern she'd uncovered. Officer Henderson had a system. Target nice cars in upscale areas if the driver was minority. Make them feel out of place. Assert dominance. Lisa's eyes filled with tears, just like he did with David Wilson. Sarah's article went live at midnight. Systematic suppression, the hidden history of Officer Henderson's traffic stops. By morning, her phone exploded with calls from national news networks. The story had legs. The police union issued a statement calling her reporting biased and inflammatory. The department spokesperson dismissed her evidence as cherry-picked data. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had one more interview scheduled with Anna Henderson herself. Mark's wife had reached out, ready to break her silence, ready to confirm what Sarah had spent weeks proving, that her husband's actions weren't isolated incidents, but part of a deeper, systemic problem. Mark Henderson stood in his garage at 3 a.m., staring at his police uniform hanging on a hook. 5 weeks of administrative duty had turned it into a symbol of everything unraveling in his life. The protests outside his house had finally died down, but the silence felt worse somehow. Upstairs, Anna slept in the guest room. She hadn't shared their bed since the incident. Today, she'd told him about her interview with Sarah Lopez. "I had to tell the truth," she'd said, "even if it costs us everything." Mark opened his laptop, something he'd been avoiding for weeks. The body cam footage played silently. He watched himself approach David Wilson's car, watched his own body language, aggressive from the start, watched his hands reach for David before there was any provocation. "What did you see?" he whispered to his past self. "What made you so sure?" His phone buzzed, a text from Johnson, his former partner. "We're all behind you, brother. Don't let them break you." But the words rang hollow now. Earlier that day, he'd read Sarah's article about Lisa Thompson. He remembered that stop, remembered feeling justified, righteous even. The garage walls seemed to close in. Mark picked up his service weapon, feeling its weight. 12 years on the force, following his father's footsteps. Protect and serve, he'd sworn. But who had he really been protecting? A memory surfaced, his first year on the job, an older officer pulling him aside after a traffic stop. "You've got good instincts, kid. You know who doesn't belong in certain neighborhoods." He'd taken it as a compliment then. The sound of the door opening made him turn. Anna stood there in her robe, looking tired. "Can't sleep either?" "I keep trying to explain it," Mark said, his voice rough. "To justify it. But every time I watch that video..." "It's not just about that video." Anna moved closer, but not too close. "It's about Lisa Thompson, about all the others, about the jokes in the locker room that you never challenged, the system you chose to protect." "I was doing my job," but even to his own ears, the words sounded weak. "Were you?" Anna picked up his badge from the workbench. "Because I remember when you first got this. You talked about making a difference, about serving the community. When did that change, Mark? When did protect and serve become control and intimidate?" Mark sat heavily on a garage stool. What if I've been wrong? Not just about Wilson, but about everything. That's the first honest thing you've said in weeks. Anna's voice softened slightly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The weight of that question filled the garage. Outside, a car alarm went off briefly. Mark thought about David Wilson's face pressed against the car hood, about Lisa Thompson's bruised wrists, about all the times he'd told himself he was just being cautious, just following protocol. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted finally. "Maybe that's the real problem," Anna said. "You're still thinking about fixing it instead of facing it, instead of changing it." The City Hall Plaza overflowed with protesters, their signs cutting sharp silhouettes against the setting sun. David Wilson stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the crowd of thousands. The torn suit from the traffic stop hung in a glass case behind him, a powerful symbol of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. "This isn't just about one traffic stop," David's words echoed through the speakers. "It's not just about one officer or one department. This is about a system that teaches some of us to fear and others to dominate." In the crowd, Lisa Thompson stood with 20 other victims of similar incidents, all wearing matching t-shirts. Traffic stops shouldn't be death sentences. Their presence made the movement impossible to dismiss as one privileged man's complaint. Sarah Lopez moved through the crowd, recording interviews. The story had evolved beyond her original investigation. Police departments across the state were now under scrutiny, Internal affairs departments faced external audits. Other journalists were uncovering similar patterns in different cities. The time for gradual change is over, David continued, his father standing stoically behind him. We demand immediate reforms, body cameras that can't be turned off, civilian review boards with real power, mandatory bias training with measurable outcomes. The crowd erupted in cheers. Among them stood Anna Henderson, her presence making headlines of its own. Her civil rights organization had taken a leading role in organizing the protests, putting her in direct opposition to her husband's colleagues. At the police station, Mark watched the coverage on the breakroom TV. Officers around him muttered about betrayal, about the erosion of police authority. But for the first time, he heard something else in their words: fear. Fear of losing the power they'd taken for granted. The movement had gained unexpected allies, business leaders concerned about the city's image, religious leaders speaking about moral imperatives, even retired police officers breaking the blue wall of silence to speak about the culture they'd helped create. David introduced his next speaker, a police academy trainer who'd resigned in protest. For years, I taught officers to see threats everywhere, the trainer admitted. We created a warrior mindset when we needed guardians. We taught fear when we should have taught communication. Social media amplified every speech, every revelation. Traffic stop truth trended nationally. Police departments in other cities began preemptively releasing their own stop data, trying to get ahead of similar scandals. The mayor, feeling the political winds shift, announced the formation of a special commission. But the protesters had learned from history. Committees and commissions often became places where momentum went to die. We don't need more studies, David declared, his voice rising. We need action. We need accountability. And we need it now. The crowd took up the chant, no more studies, action now. In the back of the plaza, Chief Justice Wilson watched his son lead the growing movement. He remembered his own father's fights, how each generation had faced the same battles in different forms. But this time felt different. This time, the videos, the data, the evidence was undeniable. The courthouse steps swarmed with media as Mark Henderson walked into his disciplinary hearing. No criminal charges had been filed, but his career and the department's future hung in the balance. David Wilson had pushed for this public hearing. Transparency, he'd insisted, was non-negotiable. Inside, the hearing room crackled with tension. The police union's lawyers sat to one side, their tables loaded with precedent cases defending officer discretion. On the other side, David's legal team had assembled statistics, expert witnesses, and testimony from past victims. Mark sat stiffly in his dress uniform, feeling the weight of every eye. Anna had chosen a seat directly behind David's team, her position clear. The hearing officer, a retired judge from another state, called the room to order. The department's case went first. They played selected portions of the body cam footage, highlighting moments when David's hands weren't visible. The union lawyer spoke about split-second decisions, about the dangers officers face, about protocol and procedure. Then, David's team began their presentation. They showed the complete footage, unedited. They presented Sarah Lopez's investigation, now supplemented with department records obtained through court orders. Former Officer Martinez testified about the missing dashcam footage, his voice steady, despite the hostile stares from his former colleagues. Officer Henderson's actions that night weren't an aberration, David's lawyer argued. They were the predictable result of a culture that views certain citizens as inherently suspicious. Lisa Thompson's testimony brought a hush to the room. She described her own encounter with Mark, her voice breaking as she recounted the humiliation, the fear, the dismissed complaint. One by one, other victims shared similar stories. The turning point came when Anna took the stand. The union lawyers objected, but the hearing officer overruled them. Mark stared at the table as his wife described their arguments after each incident, how he'd gradually changed over the years. "The man I married wanted to protect people," Anna testified, "but the system taught him to fear them instead." During a break, Mark stood alone in a courthouse bathroom, splashing water on his face. His reflection showed a man he barely recognized. The union lawyer had coached him to show no emotion, to stick to procedure and protocol. But Anna's words kept echoing in his head. The hearing resumed with expert testimony about bias in traffic stops, about department culture, about the psychological impact of warrior-style training. Mark listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time. When it was his turn to testify, he did something that shocked everyone. He went off script. "I was wrong," he began, his voice rough. The union lawyer started to stand, but Mark waved him down. "Not just that night with Mr. Wilson. I was wrong for years. We're trained to see threats everywhere, to treat every situation as potentially lethal. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. I started seeing categories, assumptions, risks." The room fell completely silent. David Wilson leaned forward slightly. Anna covered her mouth with her hand. The hearing room remained frozen after Mark's testimony. The police union lawyers huddled in urgent whispers, their defense strategy shattered by their own client's admission. David Wilson sat perfectly still, his legal training recognizing this moment for what it was, a tipping point. Outside, the crowd awaiting the decision had swelled. News helicopters circled the courthouse, their distant thrum a constant reminder of the national attention this case had drawn. Sarah Lopez worked the crowd, gathering reactions, noting how the movement had grown from a single traffic stop to a demand for systemic change. The hearing officer called a recess to review the evidence. In separate conference rooms, both sides waited. Mark sat alone, having declined his union representative's company. For the first time since that night, he felt something close to peace. The weight of pretense finally lifted. In David's conference room, his father spoke quietly. "Whatever the decision, you've already changed things. The question is, what kind of change do we want?" David studied the papers before him. Department statistics, training manuals, policy documents. "We need more than just one officer's badge," he said slowly. "We need to change how officers are trained, how they're evaluated, how they're held accountable." The bailiff called them back. The hearing room filled again, tension drawing every spine straight. The hearing officer, her face unreadable, took her seat. "Based on the evidence presented," she began, including Officer Henderson's own testimony, "this panel finds clear violations of department policy and constitutional rights." She paused, scanning the room. "However, this case has revealed issues far beyond one officer's actions." She detailed her findings: systemic failures in training, oversight, and accountability. The department's cultural problems, the pattern of discriminatory stops. Finally, she reached her recommendation. "Officer Henderson's employment with the department should be terminated," she stated. The union lawyers slumped, but she wasn't finished. "Furthermore, this panel recommends a complete external review of department practices, mandatory retraining of all officers, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board with real authority." The room erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors, racing to break the news. But David remained seated, watching Mark across the room. Their eyes met briefly, victim and perpetrator, both caught in a system larger than themselves. As people filed out, Anna approached her husband. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of both what was lost and what might still be saved. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as David emerged. But instead of triumph, his expression showed the weight of responsibility. This victory would mean nothing if it didn't lead to real change. 2 weeks after the hearing, David Wilson requested a private meeting with Mark Henderson. They met in Chief Justice Wilson's study, the same room where David had decided to fight. Mark arrived alone, no longer in uniform, looking smaller somehow. Sarah Lopez sat outside, exclusively invited to document what would happen next. Anna waited too, her presence requested by both men. No one else knew about this meeting. Not the police union, not the protest organizers, not even David's legal team. "I'm not here to forgive you," David began, standing by his father's desk. "This isn't about forgiveness. It's about change." Mark nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I understand. I've lost my job, my reputation." "Stop," David interrupted. "This isn't about what you've lost. It's about what we could build." He opened a folder, pushing it across the desk. "I have a proposal." Inside was a detailed plan. Instead of ending Mark's career in disgrace, David proposed something radical, using Mark's experience to help reform police training. The twist? Mark would work alongside civil rights organizations, including Anna's, to develop new protocols for traffic stops. "You know the system from the inside," David explained. "You've lived its failures, and now you've admitted those failures publicly. That makes you valuable." Mark stared at the documents, confusion clear on his face. "Why would you do this?" "Because firing one officer doesn't fix the system," David said. "But turning that officer into an advocate for change? That's something they can't ignore." Sarah Lopez, allowed in to document the moment, watched as understanding dawned on Mark's face. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy. David wasn't just winning the battle, he was transforming the war. Anna stepped forward then, her voice steady. "The department has already agreed to reforms, but having someone who's been on both sides, who can speak to officers in their own language about the need for change, that's priceless." The proposal included public speaking engagements, training program development, and direct involvement in the Civilian Oversight Board. Mark would have to confront his former colleagues, challenge their assumptions, and help them see what he'd finally seen. "Why me?" Mark asked finally. "After what I did?" "Because you did something rare," David cut in. "You admitted you were wrong. Not just about that night, but about the whole system. That's the first step toward real change." Chief Justice Wilson, who had been silently observing, spoke at last. "Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about transformation." Mark looked at the proposal again, then at Anna. She nodded slightly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. "When do we start?" Mark asked. David smiled for the first time. "We already have. This meeting, this moment, it's being documented. Tomorrow, Sarah publishes the story, not about the bad cop who got fired, but about the system that's finally starting to change." Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that in this quiet study, a new approach to justice was taking shape. Not through force or fear, but through the harder, braver work of transformation. The weight of truth had bent them all, but it hadn't broken them. Instead, it had forged something new, a pathway forward, built on the understanding that real change begins not with punishment, but with the courage to see ourselves clearly and the willingness to do better.